Welcome, everyone, to The Deep Dive. There's this undeniable feeling right now, isn't there? A sense that we're standing at a really critical juncture, maybe a real fork in the road for the United States, both economically and, well, politically, too. Things are moving so fast, and for many of us, it can feel kind of overwhelming, just trying to keep up with all the big shifts happening around us. Today, we're going to try and cut through some of that noise, give you a clear, hopefully concise, but still deeply informed picture of what might be shaping America's near future.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here is how all these different threads seem to be weaving together. It suggests some pretty profound implications, not just for the next couple of years, but maybe even for decades to come. It really feels like a moment of significant inflection.
That really does underline the long-term stakes, doesn't it? So our mission for this deep dive is to explore a collection of recent sources, specifically a series of analyses from Barackface, which is a research collective known for its detailed economic and political forecasts. These sources, they paint a really compelling picture of America right now, in mid-2025. They reveal some significant gambles being made, strategies unfolding, and potential transformations that are, well, already underway. We're going to try and pull out the most critical insights from this material, connect the dots between things that might seem separate, and help you understand what might really be shaping America's path forward. Okay, so let's unpack this, right? So this feeling, this sense that we're at a critical point, it isn't just about, grand political maneuvers. It's deeply rooted in the economy, in the current swirling right under our feet. And when we dive into these sources, a pretty grim term keeps popping up, one that's making an unwelcome comeback: stagflation. Now, for a lot of us, that might sound like something straight out of a dusty old economics textbook, right?
Oh, absolutely. A relic.
But apparently, according to these sources, it's back with an unsettling force.
Indeed. And the sources define stagflation pretty clearly. It's a deeply troubling economic condition. You've got three things happening at once: high inflation, stagnant economic growth, and rising unemployment. It's a triple threat, really, something most economists hoped they'd left behind in the history books.
Triple threat. That sounds bad.
It is, but what makes it so, insidious isn't just those three components. It's how it creates this policy trap. It leaves central banks, like the Federal Reserve, with just an agonizing choice. Do you fight the inflation? Well, if you do, you risk deepening the economic slowdown, maybe even causing a recession. Or do you try to support growth, but then you risk letting prices spiral completely out of control? It's kind of a lose-lose situation for policymakers, and that's the real bite here, I think.
And yeah, for many of us listening, that's a chilling echo of a really difficult economic time, the 1970s. The sources definitely highlight that historical link. It was a really tough decade for the U.S. economy. You had the OPEC oil embargo.
Oh, the gas lines.
Exactly, those awful gas lines. And the end of the Bretton Woods system, the thing that had stabilized global currencies for decades by pegging them to the U.S. dollar, which was tied to gold. When that collapsed, it unleashed all sorts of new inflationary pressures. It just created this sort of economic malaise that left a really lasting scar. And for decades after that, the whole idea of stagflation happening again in the U.S. was considered, well, like you said, a relic, something we'd learn from, move past.
Precisely. It was maybe a concept for first-year econ students, but not a current worry. But now, as of mid-2025, our sources are indicating this specter has returned, and with real force. So the question now isn't if it's a risk, but maybe how pervasive it's going to become and what unique features it might have this time around.
So what makes the current situation ripe for this kind of concern? What's different now?
Well, according to these analyses, it boils down to a really specific combination of policy choices. Choices that are directly hitting both supply chains and the labor market in ways we haven't really seen before, certainly not simultaneously like this.
Okay, and this is where that interconnectedness really starts to snap into focus.
Yeah.
Right? Because the sources point to two seismic policy moves, they call them, from 2025 that are really shaking things up. First, there's what the sources dub the Liberation Day tariffs. These were announced back in April 2025, and they are incredibly broad. We're talking covering imports from China, the European Union, Mexico, even traditionally close allies like Canada.
Yeah, it's sweeping.
And the rates are significant, like 10% to 25% on key stuff: steel, semiconductors, consumer electronics, cars. And then, of course, you get the inevitable blowback retaliatory agricultural tariffs from other countries hit by these new U.S. protections.
And this is a really critical point because tariffs, as the sources explain it, they fundamentally function as a negative supply shock. Think about it this way. If you slap a big tax on imported goods, it directly raises costs for businesses here that rely on those imports. Could be a car maker needing foreign steel or an electronics firm sourcing chips from overseas.
Bro.
Those higher costs, well, they almost always get passed on to consumers. That means higher prices for us. Plus, these kinds of broad tariffs usually invite immediate and often substantial retaliation from other countries. That hits our own exports hard, hurting American farmers, manufacturers trying to sell their goods abroad. And what's particularly tricky about this kind of inflation, the supply shock kind, is that it's much harder for central banks like the Fed to control without also causing a recession. It's different from inflation driven by, say, really strong consumer demand. Here, you're pushing up prices by essentially making goods scarcer and more expensive, not because the economy is booming. It's like an artificial bottleneck, maybe designed to reshape trade, but it has these significant domestic price consequences.
Okay, so you got this squeeze from the tariffs hitting the supply of goods. But as if that wasn't enough pressure, our sources layer on another major policy choice that's hitting the workforce hard: the mass deportation drive. The sources estimate this is reducing the U.S. workforce by, wow, 1 to 2 million workers annually. That's a huge number.
It's significant, yeah.
And it's not just a general reduction across the board, is it? It's
Right.
particularly hitting sectors that have historically relied pretty heavily on migrant labor. Think agriculture, construction, hospitality, logistics. I mean, the backbone of a lot of foundational industries.
Absolutely. And the economic impact there is quite direct, quite severe, and arguably pretty immediate. You see these sectors facing really acute labor shortages. So in farming, for example, you might have crops literally rotting in the fields because there's no one to pick them. That leads to scarcity, higher food prices down the line. In construction, projects get delayed, costs go up, critical infrastructure doesn't get built as quickly. Now, in some cases, this can lead to wages going up as employers desperately scramble to find any workers they can.
Right, basic supply and demand for labor.
Exactly. But the overall effect, the bigger picture, is a reduction in output, a drop in efficiency across these really vital industries. The sources highlight that some businesses, especially the smaller and medium-sized ones, are really struggling to find replacement workers. They might have to cut operating hours or even close down entirely. But what's truly striking here is how these two policies, the tariffs squeezing goods, the deportations squeezing labor, are converging. They're happening at the same time. This dual pressure creates a really powerful, almost perfect storm, fostering inflationary pressure even as the underlying economic growth starts to slow down because capacity is reduced and input costs are higher.
Wow. So with these powerful forces pushing and pulling the economy in different directions, the big question becomes, are we actually seeing hard evidence of this stagflationary drift yet? Our sources seem to point to some pretty clear warning signs. They were already flashing by the summer of 2025.
Yes, the leading indicators definitely started to line up with that textbook definition, painting a pretty concerning picture. First off, GDP growth forecasts got downgraded pretty significantly. They fell from a projected 2.4% in 2024 down to only about 1.5% expected for 2025. That's a noticeable slowdown in overall economic expansion and wasn't really expected.
Okay, slower growth. What else?
Second, inflation just stayed stubbornly sticky. It was hovering around 4%, even though the Federal Reserve had already been trying to tighten things up with rate hikes. It just wasn't coming down towards their 2% target. That tells you price pressures are persistent, they're broad-based. Third, the jobs market showed undeniable signs of softening. Payroll growth slowed way down, and the Institute for Supply Management Services report, that's a key indicator for the huge service sector, it showed a big spike in prices paid. That means businesses are facing much higher costs for their inputs, for labor.
Not good.
Fourth, we saw the dollar weakening on international exchanges. That just compounds the problem, right? Makes imports even more expensive for American consumers and businesses. And finally, you started hearing corporate earnings warnings. More and more retail and manufacturing firms were coming out and saying, look, tariffs and labor shortages are hurting our margins, they're hitting our profitability. So you take all those trends together, slowing growth, rising prices, disruptions in the labor market, that's the classic profile of stagflation. It makes it feel like much more than just some theoretical risk.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like the kind of challenge that brings back some uncomfortable memories. And the sources definitely lean into that, don't they? They draw some stark parallels to past economic struggles, almost like a historical warning sign.
That's right. The most immediate echo, of course, is the 1970s. The sources revisit that era pretty vividly. They recall those twin oil shocks that dramatically jacked up energy costs, the infamous gas lines symbolizing consumer misery, the double-digit inflation that just ate away at people's purchasing power, and the stagnation of real incomes wages just weren't keeping up with prices. It was a period where the Federal Reserve, under Chairman Paul Volcker back then, eventually had to take drastic action. They crushed inflation with brutally high interest rates. I mean, pushing the main federal funds rate up to 20% at one point.
20%. Wow.
Unimaginable today, right? But it worked eventually. But it came at a huge cost. A deep, painful recession with unemployment soaring. It's a really sobering reminder of the agonizing choices central banks face when they're staring down stagflation. The sheer political will needed to impose that kind of economic pain is enormous. And the sources do raise the question of whether that same resolve exists today.
But the sources don't just look back at the 70s, do they? They also touch briefly on Japan's lost decades, starting around the 1990s. That was a different kind of stagnation, though, wasn't it? More about deflation, falling prices.
It was, yes. And the sources make that distinction, which is really crucial for understanding the current U.S. situation. Japan's experience involved a few things: demographic decline, an aging, shrinking population, a massive financial hangover from their asset bubble bursting in the late 80s, and some policy missteps. All that led to this prolonged cycle of economic stagnation, but often characterized by deflationary pressures, falling prices, not rising ones. That meant businesses and consumers tended to delay spending, waiting for prices to fall further, which just dampened growth even more.
Okay, so how does that compare to what the sources say about the U.S. now?
Well, the U.S. scenario, as presented in the sources, is explicitly described as an inflationary version of stagnation Japan with rising prices instead of falling ones. And that difference is critical because it completely flips the script for the Federal Reserve. In deflation, the Fed might try to stimulate the economy with super low interest rates, but with inflationary stagnation, they're pressured to raise rates to cool prices. The lesson from both historical examples, though, is pretty stark. Once an economy gets stuck in one of these low-growth traps, whether it's inflationary like the 70s or deflationary like Japan, getting out is incredibly difficult and often requires immense political and economic sacrifice.
Which leads us straight back to the Federal Reserve's current nightmare. Given these conflicting pressures, tariffs pushing inflation up, deportations hitting labor, maybe slowing output, where does this lead the Fed? Our sources paint this picture of a Scylla and Charybdis dilemma, basically an impossible choice. Can you help us really grasp the bind they're in?
Yeah, it's a classic economic paradox, and it really seems to have policymakers cornered, according to these analyses. Okay, so if the Fed decides to raise interest rates even higher to fight that tariff-driven inflation and maybe the wage pressures coming from labor shortages, well, then it risks deepening the stagnation. It could push the economy into a more severe slowdown, maybe even a full-blown recession, because higher rates make borrowing more expensive, right? That tends to stifle business investment, consumer spending on big-ticket items.
Okay, that's one horn of the dilemma. What's the other?
The other is, what if they cut rates instead? Maybe try to support economic growth, ease the burden on businesses and consumers feeling the squeeze. Well, if they do that, they risk pouring fuel on the inflationary fire. They could de-anchor inflation expectations, meaning people start expecting prices to keep rising rapidly, and that can lead to a persistent upward spiral. This really mirrors the bind central banks were in during the 1970s, where they often lost credibility because they kept flip-flopping between trying to fight inflation and trying to boost growth. Fed Chair Jerome Powell, according to the sources, has generally maintained a pretty cautious, maybe even slightly hawkish stance recently, signaling that rate cuts are highly unlikely in 2025. This probably indicates some pretty intense internal debates and uncertainty within the Fed itself. You likely have some arguing, look, maybe we have to accept higher inflation for a while to keep the economy growing, while others are saying, no, our top priority has to be fighting inflation to maintain our credibility no matter the short-term economic cost.
So, given all of this complex picture, these historical echoes, the Fed's difficult position, what's the general feeling among economists? Are they all basically saying, yep, stagflation is here, get used to it? Or are there different viewpoints, maybe even some optimism floating around?
That's a really important question, and the sources definitely present a clear divide here. It's not monolithic. Understanding both sides is key. On one side, you absolutely have significant mainstream alarm. Prominent economists, major institutions, they are definitely sounding the alarm about these escalating stagflation risks. For instance, Paul Krugman, Nobel laureate at the New York Times, he's explicitly argued the tariffs are a self-inflicted wound. He directly compares the situation to a 1970s-style stagflationary trap, really emphasizing how these trade barriers act like a tax on the supply side, which is a much tougher kind of inflation to deal with.
Okay, Krugman's worried.
Yeah.
Who else?
Torsten Slok from Apollo Global, a big investment firm, he emphasizes how the tariffs, the mass deportations, and a weakening dollar are all working together, simultaneously boosting prices and weighing on growth, as he put it. Creates a really potent negative mix for the economy. Mohammed El-Arian at Allianz, another widely respected voice, he also warns that tariffs significantly heighten the stagflation risk. Though he does add a nuance, he thinks highly targeted tariffs might have some limited benefits, but he believes that nuance is totally missing from the current broad tariff policy.
So it's not just these well-known names from academia or finance raising red flags. It seems like a broader concern filtering through.
Definitely not just them. Justin Wolfers from the University of Michigan, who knows a lot about labor markets and policy, he bluntly called the current policy mix stagflationary by design, basically saying these outcomes are exactly what you'd expect from these policy choices. Major consulting firms, economic forecasters like EY and Pantheon Macroeconomics, they're also putting numbers on it. Their models project that these new tariffs alone will likely cut U.S. GDP by a noticeable 1 to 1.4% over 2025-2026, while at the same time adding a full percentage point to inflation. That's a direct, measurable trade-off. Less growth, more inflation.
Wow.
And even economists at Bank of America are on record saying they expect no Fed rate cuts at all in 2025, specifically because inflation is staying so sticky, largely due to the effects of deportations and tariffs. That pushes any hope of monetary relief further down the road. What's really notable here is that these warnings aren't just coming from one political or ideological side. Even usually cautious, more centrist institutions are identifying stagflation as a primary baseline risk now. That suggests a pretty broad professional concern.
Okay, that's a powerful consensus building on the worried side. But you mentioned a divide. Are there economists pushing back, people who are maybe more optimistic or who disagree that this stagflation narrative is the whole story? Maybe they see different forces at play.
Yes, absolutely. There are definitely dissenting perspectives, and they make different arguments. Some argue the stagflation narrative is overstated because there might be offsetting factors, or they interpret the long-term impact of these policies differently. For example, Nouriel Roubini, who's famously known as Dr. Doom for his usually bearish forecasts, he surprisingly suggests that maybe, just maybe, an AI-driven productivity boom could propel growth above 3%.
AI saves the day.
Potentially, yeah. That kind of productivity surge could naturally offset some of these negative policy shocks by increasing output and efficiency across the economy. His perspective is basically that technological advances might create a new wave of growth, powerful enough to outrun these inflationary headwinds. Then you have firms like Moody's Analytics. While they acknowledge a risk of modest stagflation, they don't foresee a full-blown 1970s-style crisis. They think growth might slow, sure, but maybe not an outright recession. They see the U.S. economy as potentially resilient enough to absorb some of these shocks. Oxford Economics has a similar take. They predict GDP growth might sustain itself around 2% in 2025. And they also suggest that maybe the negative effects of the deportations are being overstated. Perhaps native hiring and, crucially, automation can step in more effectively to fill those labor gaps than some fear. Their argument is that businesses might adapt faster than expected, investing in automation or training domestic workers.
So AI and automation are kind of the potential heroes in this counter-narrative, pushing back against the stagflation fears.
They feature prominently, yes. Even Bank of America, in some of their other reports, suggests that significant investment in technology, coupled with a renewed focus on reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., could help the country avoid the worst-case stagflation outcomes. The idea is that strengthening domestic supply chains and boosting long-term productivity could counteract the negative shocks. And then, of course, you have economists more aligned with the Trump administration's thinking, like Stephen Moore and Arthur Laffer. They argue directly that the tariffs are actually a good thing in the long run. They say tariffs accelerate the reshoring of industries, protect domestic jobs, and ultimately create long-term competitiveness for the U.S. economy. Their fundamental case is basically short-term pain equals long-term gain. They see the higher prices and supply disruptions now as a necessary investment to make the U.S. economy more self-reliant and robust down the road. They view these policies as strategically sound.
Okay, so it's definitely not a unanimous prediction. You've got strong counter-arguments rooted in faith in American innovation, maybe the strategic benefits of these policies. Understanding both sides of this debate, that mainstream alarm and this dissenting optimism, is really crucial for you, our listener, to get a complete picture of where America's economy might be heading. It really does sound like a high-stakes gamble, as the sources put it, with potentially profound implications for pretty much every household and every business. Okay, but this economic storm, it isn't just brewing in isolation, is it? It's tangled up with, and in many ways seems to be actively shaped by, equally dramatic shifts happening on the political front. Our sources reveal what sounds like an unfolding strategy, particularly from the GOP side, that aims to fundamentally reshape American power structures. It's described almost like a calculated plot to usher in a near unbreakable House majority. The goal apparently is to gain maybe more than 40 seats, but, and this is the kicker, without winning any more support from voters. That sounds like quite an ambition, almost like a blueprint for locking in power.
It is quite something, and the sources provide some pretty alarming specific details on how this is supposedly being attempted, going way beyond just typical election campaigning. Take Texas, for example, a state already known for, let's say, aggressive redistricting tactics. Republicans there are actively pushing a plan, according to these sources, to basically carve out 5 new, safe GOP House seats. This is despite the state's rapid demographic shifts, which you might think would favor Democrats.
5 seats just from Texas.
From Texas. And the sources indicate that those 5 seats alone could potentially be enough to stop the Democrats from retaking the House majority in the 2026 midterm elections. But this Texas plan is apparently just one piece of a much larger puzzle. It's part of a broader redistricting effort across the country. Republicans are reportedly aiming to squeeze out maybe a dozen or more new GOP seats from states like Florida, Missouri, Indiana, places where they control the state legislatures, and often the state Supreme Courts. If they succeed, this effort could indeed see Republicans pick up over 40 seats without necessarily increasing their share of the popular vote. This comes from internal GOP operative discussions highlighted by the sources.
Wow, 40 seats without winning more votes.
Well, the Barackface analyses emphasize these discussions, which apparently often happen on platforms like Steve Bannon's War Room podcast, outline 3 key changes Republicans are banking on. First, good old-fashioned but maybe supercharged partisan gerrymandering. Second, hoping for a maximalist Supreme Court ruling that effectively guts the Voting Rights Act. And third, this really unprecedented idea of a mid-decade census designed specifically to shift congressional apportionment. One quote cited even suggests Democrats could lose a staggering 42 seats if this whole strategy plays out.
Okay, let's break down that 3-pronged approach. Start with partisan gerrymandering. We hear that term thrown around a lot, but for anyone who isn't totally clear, what does that actually involve? How does it work on the ground?
Right. So partisan gerrymandering, as the sources describe it here, is basically manipulating the boundaries of election districts to deliberately create an unfair, built-in advantage for one political party. It's like rigging the game before anyone even votes. Think of drawing the district lines to do one of 2 things. Either you pack your opponent's voters into just a few districts. They win those districts by huge margins, sure, but their votes are essentially wasted everywhere else because they have no influence in surrounding districts.
Okay, packing. What's the other way?
The other way is cracking. You take a concentration of your opponent's voters and you spread them thinly across many different districts so they become a minority in each one, making it really hard for them to ever form a majority anywhere. This is done with incredible precision these days, using detailed voter data, demographic maps, sophisticated computer algorithms. The goal isn't just to win the next election, it's often to create safe seats that are practically immune to shifts in public opinion. It allows potentially a minority of voters statewide to control a majority of the congressional seats. It's a tactic that many argue fundamentally undermines the whole principle of one person, one vote.
Okay, that's gerrymandering. The second prong sounds even more significant. Gutting Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the VRA. What exactly is Section 2, and why is it considered so vital for fair representation, especially in this context?
Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is truly a landmark piece of civil rights legislation. It came directly out of the struggles of the civil rights movement. Broadly speaking, it bans any voting practice or procedure that results in discrimination on the basis of race or color. It makes it illegal for any state or local government to impose voting rules that deny or limit the right to vote because of someone's race. Historically, it's been incredibly important, particularly in the South, for guaranteeing the creation of House districts where the majority of voters belong to a specific minority group. These are often called majority-minority districts.
Point of those districts is?
The point is to allow members of those minority groups who might otherwise have their votes diluted in majority-white districts to actually elect representatives of their choice, to ensure their voices are heard in Congress, their communities get represented fairly. Now, the sources state that Republicans are hoping the Supreme Court will issue what's known as a maximalist ruling regarding Section 2.
Maximalist ruling. What does that mean?
It basically means a ruling that interprets the law in the broadest possible way to achieve a certain outcome in this case, severely limiting the VRA's reach and power. They anticipate, or hope, this kind of ruling would essentially give states a green light to redraw maps in ways that dilute the voting power of minority communities, especially Black voters in the South. The practical effect could be the near elimination of Black representation in Congress from large parts of the country, and, as a direct political consequence, the elimination of many Democratic-held seats across the South. It would fundamentally reshape the electoral map, potentially for generations.
That sounds like a huge, almost revolutionary change in how representation could work, especially given the whole history and purpose of the VRA. Have parts of the VRA been weakened like this before? Is there a precedent?
Yes, unfortunately there is, and it sets a pretty troubling precedent, according to civil rights advocates. The Supreme Court, particularly its conservative majority in recent decades, has steadily chipped away at the Voting Rights Act's protections. A really key case was Shelby County v. Holder back in 2013. That ruling didn't gut Section 2 directly, but it dismantled another critical piece, Section 5. Section 5 required certain states and jurisdictions, mostly in the South with a documented history of voting discrimination, to get federal approval pre-clearance, it was called, before they could change their voting laws or procedures. When the court struck down the formula used for pre-clearance, it essentially gave those states a free hand to change voting rules without federal oversight, and that led almost immediately to a wave of new, often restrictive voting laws being passed.
So Shelby opened the door, and now the hope is to go after Section 2 itself.
That seems to be the scenario outlined in the sources, and the potential political gains for Republicans are made pretty clear by the numbers. In 2024, there were 141 majority-minority House districts across the country, and a very significant chunk of those 119 districts elected Democrats. So you can see if Republicans succeed in getting a court ruling that allows them to effectively eliminate many of those districts, the impact on Democratic representation in the House would be massive. It could shift the balance of power decisively for decades, far beyond just winning or losing a single election cycle.
Okay, gerrymandering, gutting the VRA. And then there's the third prong, which the sources call an unprecedented and unconstitutional mid-decade census. This one really jumped out at me. Stephen Miller, who was a top advisor in the Trump White House, apparently claimed on Fox News that Democrats rigged the 2020 census by including illegal aliens. But isn't the census supposed to count everyone living here, regardless of their citizenship status? That seems to fly right in the face of, well, centuries of American history.
It absolutely does. And this is where the sources provide really critical clarification and historical context, directly pushing back against Miller's narrative. First, despite Miller's claim about Democrats rigging it, it's worth remembering, as the sources point out, that Donald Trump himself was president and his administration was in charge of conducting the 2020 census. Second, and more fundamentally, non-citizens have been counted in every single U.S. census since the very first one in 1790. It's not a new thing, it's how it's always been done. The framers of the Constitution were explicit about this. Article 1, Section 2 says that apportionment of representatives among the states shall be based on the whole number of persons in each state. Persons, not citizens. It was a foundational principle to ensure representation was based on the actual population living in each state.
So it wasn't just an oversight, it was intentional.
Exactly. And it's also worth noting, as the sources remind us, that for the 2020 census, the Trump administration itself pushed hard to add a question about citizenship status to the census form. That effort was ultimately blocked by the courts, but the very fact they wanted to ask the question implicitly acknowledges that the census was, in fact, designed and understood to count all persons residing in the U.S., including non-citizens, for the purpose of apportionment. The shift now, the radical part, is this idea of selectively excluding certain populations from the count used for dividing up congressional seats, a move completely divorced from historical practice and constitutional understanding.
Okay, so if non-citizens have always been counted, what was the real goal behind Miller's argument? Why push for this mid-decade census and excluding these groups? What are they actually trying to achieve politically?
Well, Miller didn't really hide the ball, according to the sources. He went on to explicitly state the partisan objective behind Trump's proposed mid-decade census plan. He said quite plainly that 20 to 30 House Democrat seats wouldn't exist but for illegal aliens. So it highlights a very clear, unvarnished partisan goal. Use a novel interpretation of the census and the Constitution to directly reallocate political power away from Democrats.
And it affects more than just the House, right?
Potentially, yes. Charlie Kirk, who's a prominent right-wing activist with close ties to Trump, apparently took it even further in an interview cited by the sources. Kirk asserted that this census scheme could also help lock Democrats out of the presidency. How? By potentially subtracting, he claimed, 20 electoral votes from Democrats in the Electoral College system. His logic is that since the number of Electoral College votes each state gets is tied directly to its total number of senators and representatives in Congress, changing the apportionment of House seats would automatically change the Electoral College math as well. So it's presented as this audacious, comprehensive plan to fundamentally reshape both the congressional map and the presidential electoral map, aiming for potentially a permanent shift in political power towards Republicans.
This just sounds like it would inevitably face massive legal challenges, given, like you said, centuries of precedent and the actual language in the Constitution. What do the sources say about the legality? Is this mid-decade census for reapportionment even possible?
You're absolutely right to question the legality. The legal obstacles are immense, and the sources state very clearly that the GOP census plan will almost certainly be challenged in court. There's existing federal law that governs the census. Title 13 of the U.S. Code says that a mid-decade census can be conducted for statistical purposes, but the law specifies that the decennial census, the one every 10 years, is the one used, quote, for the apportionment of representatives in Congress among the several states. And critically, as we discussed, since the country's founding in 1789, the U.S. has always conducted its census once a decade for apportionment. Never has a mid-decade census been used for that purpose. This deeply entrenched historical practice and the existing legal framework strongly suggest that trying to use a mid-decade census for reapportionment would face significant, probably insurmountable hurdles in the courts. It seems like a real long shot legally, a gamble on reinterpreting fundamental constitutional principles.
Okay, so you have these incredibly aggressive, maybe legally dubious strategies unfolding. What's the Democratic response described in the sources? How are they preparing to counter what sounds like a concerted effort to, well, rewrite the rules of American democracy?
Well, Democrats, particularly those in states like Texas, where these battles are already raging, are viewing this whole push, the gerrymandering, the VRA attacks, the census plan, as a serious wake-up call, according to the sources. They seem to recognize the severity, the potentially anti-democratic nature of what's being proposed. Their stated strategy, as quoted from one Texas Democrat named Jones, is basically twofold. First, continue to overperform electorally, meaning win elections, even on unfavorable maps, to at least get back the majority. And second, be ready for an electoral fight that goes beyond normal politics. Jones added, because we've already seen what happens when this president or even this Congress doesn't get what they want. They don't always play by the rules. They just change the rules to make it benefit them. So it indicates this recognition that traditional political campaigning might not be enough against these kinds of tactics. The fight might shift towards defending the actual mechanisms of democracy, the rules of the game itself. It sounds like bracing for a fundamental challenge to the system.
Right, it's becoming really clear these economic pressures and these political maneuvers aren't happening in separate silos. They're deeply intertwined. And this is where the true strategic depth, or maybe the predicted consequences revealed in our sources, comes into sharp focus. They draw a direct, almost inevitable sounding line from that economic pain caused by tariffs straight back to profound political consequences. It's not just about economics. It's framed as a political weapon.
Absolutely. The sources basically predict a chain reaction. Step 1. The tariffs lead to measurable price increases for consumers. You'll feel it at the grocery store, buying electronics, maybe looking at a new car. It hits everyday life. Step 2. Like clockwork, as the sources put it, these unavoidable price hikes will translate into lower poll numbers for the sitting president. Public trust erodes, support drops.
And how low are we talking here? What kind of political damage could this actually do to the current administration, and maybe even looking beyond that?
Well, the sources suggest that if a president's poll numbers were to sink down into the low 30s, that's generally considered politically devastating territory. This isn't just a minor dip in popularity, it signals a pretty profound rejection by a large chunk of the electorate. At that point, the prediction is that many members of the president's own party serving in Congress might start looking out for themselves. They might decide it's better to abandon ship than go down with it, fearing for their own re-election chances if they stay closely tied to an unpopular leader and what's perceived as a failing economic policy.
So internal party fractures.
Exactly. It can lead to internal dissent, maybe challenges to party leadership, a general breakdown of political cohesion within the president's party, and the sources explicitly loop back to that rare consensus among economists we talked about earlier, the idea that tariffs hurt consumers. That point crosses ideological lines, which powerfully reinforces the prediction here. It suggests this isn't just a partisan talking point, it's a widely accepted economic reality expected to have direct, swift political fallout. It's framed as a clear cause and effect, bad economic policy leading to bad poll numbers.
Okay, so let's follow that chain reaction.
hmm
If the president's approval really tanks, sinks into those low 30s, what are the immediate implications for control of Congress, specifically the House and the Senate?
The sources are pretty blunt about the House. If the president's approval craters into the low 30s, the House is seen as essentially gone for the Republicans. It would likely signal a clear, decisive rejection by voters in the midterm elections. Historical patterns are pretty strong on this. When a sitting president is that unpopular, their party almost always suffers massive losses in the House during the midterms. Voters tend to take out their frustrations, especially economic ones, on the party in power.
Okay, the House seems pretty clear-cut in that scenario. What about the Senate?
The Senate is described as trickier. Why? Because it has this inherent structural, almost operating system level advantage, as the sources put it, that often keeps it tilted towards or in the grip of white conservative voters in states. This structural advantage comes mainly from the fact that every state gets two senators, regardless of population. So smaller, often more rural and conservative states have disproportionate power compared to large, diverse states. Plus, a lot of current Democratic Senate seats happen to be in states that are politically competitive or even lean Republican overall. However, and this is a big caveat in the sources with presidential approval numbers, that low, deep in the 30s, even the Senate could potentially be in play. The sources literally never say never. The implication is that a complete widespread collapse of public support for the president could create an electoral wave strong enough to overcome even those structural barriers, putting seats at risk that might normally be considered safe. It paints a picture of a potential political tsunami.
Okay, so this potential political tsunami, driven by economic pain, leads us to what the sources intriguingly call the dawn of a new 50-year pendulum swing in American politics. Now, this sounds like more than just the usual back and forth between parties. It sounds like a fundamental redefinition of American governance is being predicted here. The sources suggest the sort of centrist wing of the Democratic Party seems missing in action in this scenario. And instead, it's the AOC Mamdani Bernie Warren crowd, the progressive wing, who will be the ones to raise the flag. What kind of vision are they supposedly bringing that could possibly usher in such a profound, long-lasting shift?
Yeah, it's described as nothing less than a tectonic shift, not just fiddling around the edges with policy tweaks. The sources explicitly compare the potential scale of this shift to the kind of transformative visions brought by figures like Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s with the New Deal, or maybe Ronald Reagan in the 1980s with his conservative revolution. Both of them ushered in a dominant political philosophy, a governing paradigm, that really lasted for decades. So the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, represented by names like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jamal Bowman, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, is seen in these analyses as bringing a comprehensive, fundamentally new approach to American progressivism. It's one that directly questions the prevailing sort of neoliberal consensus that has largely dominated economic policy from both parties for the last 40 or 50 years. Their vision, as portrayed here, goes way beyond just incremental changes. It's presented as a profound rethinking of the social contract itself, potentially a return to an era where the government's role in ensuring economic fairness and providing public goods is radically redefined, moving beyond just campaign promises to become actually entrenched in law. It's framed as a true ideological turning point for America.
And the sources don't just talk in hypotheticals, do they? They provide some really specific illustrative policies that kind of bring this vision down to earth, show how it might directly impact people's lives. For example, they mention Vienna-style social housing. What is that exactly, and why is it highlighted as a key part of this potential new vision?
Right. Vienna-style social housing is presented as a really radical departure from how the U.S. typically approaches housing, which relies heavily on private markets, tax breaks for developers, maybe some limited rental assistance. In Vienna, Austria, the city itself actually owns and manages a huge amount of high-quality, affordable housing. It accounts for something like 60% of the city's entire housing stock. And importantly, it's designed not just for the very poor, but for a broad mix of incomes, which helps create truly integrated, stable communities, not concentrated poverty. Tenants pay rent based on what they can afford, ensuring it stays affordable, and the housing itself remains permanently off the speculative market.
So it's public housing, but maybe not like the image some people have in the U.S.
Exactly. It's generally well-maintained, desirable housing. And the sources highlight a key argument. This model has supposedly been proven to be more cost-effective than the billions the U.S. already spends on things like mortgage interest deductions, which mostly benefit wealthier homeowners, or tax breaks for developers, policies which often just end up inflating housing prices anyway. The crucial insight presented here is that it's not just about providing basic shelter, it's about treating housing as more of a human right, a public good, maybe similar to how we think about public education. The sources suggest that once the math, the cost effectiveness, and the tangible benefits like lower housing costs for everyone, more stable neighborhoods, reduced homelessness are made clear, there could be broad public support for similar approaches in other big areas. Think universal health care, accessible higher education, modern public infrastructure. So housing is kind of the example, but it points towards a much broader, more holistic approach to public investment in social welfare, fundamentally recalibrating the government's role.
Okay, that's a big vision on the spending and investment side. What about the other side of the ledger? How would this potentially be funded? The sources mention a specific top tax rate being part of this transformation.
Yes, they do. The sources indicate that the economic models underlying this progressive vision point towards a top marginal tax rate of somewhere around 70% for the very wealthiest Americans. Now, it's crucial to understand this would be a marginal rate. It would only apply to income earned above a very high threshold, millions of dollars per year, not on every dollar earned.
Still, 70% sounds incredibly high compared to today.
It does compared to recent decades, but the sources immediately provide historical context to sort of normalize what might otherwise seem like a really extreme proposal. They state directly that this is far from unprecedented. They remind us that the United States thrived as a capitalist democracy with a 90% top rate for decades.
90%. When was that?
That was the top marginal rate for much of the post-World War II era, particularly through the 1950s and into the early 1960s during the Eisenhower administration, for example. And that period, remember, saw massive public investments like the interstate highway system, a booming middle class, significant technological progress, and the U.S. winning the Cold War. So the sources then directly confront the socialism label that often gets thrown at proposals like a 70% top rate. They basically ask, if 70% is socialism, then perhaps it's time to revisit what's actually wrong with that, given that historical context. So it's presented not just as a policy number, but as a direct challenge to the prevailing economic orthodoxy of the last few decades. It's an argument that high top marginal tax rates are perfectly compatible with and maybe even historically preceded periods of robust capitalist growth and significantly lower inequality. It's fundamentally an argument for reinvesting a larger share of national wealth back into public goods and services.
Okay, so you have this ambitious vision, specific policies like social housing, higher taxes on the wealthy. How do the sources envision this progressive wing actually gaining the power needed to push these ideas through, especially against what would likely be fierce opposition? What's this frustration to momentum cycle they describe? It sounds like a kind of strategic long game.
It is laid out as a fascinating strategic vision, yeah. Almost like a kind of political jujitsu, using the system's own friction to build power. The scenario outlined in the sources is quite specific. It imagines the progressive wing, maybe symbolized by the AOC wing, fully taking over the Democratic Party, really capitalizing on that widespread public frustration with the economy we discussed earlier, the stagflation, the inequality. This frustration fuels electoral success, leading them to win back the House of Representatives decisively in the 2026 midterms. Maybe they even come close to winning the Senate, but fall just short of a majority there. Okay, so then what happens for the next 2 years? The House, now under progressive leadership, starts passing bill after bill based on this new vision. Major investments in social housing, steps toward universal health care, aggressive climate action, wealth taxes, and so on.
But they don't control the Senate in this scenario.
Exactly. So the sources predict these popular bills would then get consistently stonewalled in the Senate. The structural advantages of smaller states may be the filibuster would block their passage. Now here's the jujitsu part. This legislative gridlock, this frustration of seeing popular ideas blocked, wouldn't necessarily lead to public apathy or disillusionment, according to this theory. Instead, it would fuel momentum for even bigger electoral gains later. The public, seeing clear solutions being proposed by the House but blocked by an obstructionist Senate, would become even more galvanized for change. Specifically, this dynamic could create the perfect conditions for a successful presidential bid by someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2028, running explicitly on a platform of breaking the gridlock and delivering on these promises. And that presidential win, combined with the ongoing public demand, could then potentially lead to Democrats finally winning a blue Senate majority as well, giving them the power to actually enact these ambitious policies into law. It's presented as a calculated strategy. Demonstrate competence and vision in the House, highlight the obstruction in the Senate, and use that contrast to build overwhelming public demand for fundamental systemic change.
It definitely sounds like a long game, but one with a very clear, almost revolutionary end goal in mind.
Precisely. The ultimate aim described for this potential 50-year pendulum swing isn't just winning elections. It's for the U.S. to finally, truly confront and tackle these deep-seated systemic problems that have plagued the country for generations. Things like pervasive homelessness, entrenched poverty, widespread malnutrition in a wealthy country, the crushing burden of student loan debt and medical debt that holds millions back. The sources summarize this grand ambition by stating that, under this vision, economic fairness would stop being just rhetoric, just a talking point politicians use, and would instead actually become law. It would be implemented through concrete policies, through changes in taxation, through massive public investment, fundamentally reordering American society and the economy to prioritize collective well-being and shared prosperity.
So the initial trigger might be the economic pain from something like tariffs. But the transformation envisioned here goes so much further than just trade policy. It really could, according to these sources, mark the start of America's next major political era, a whole new chapter driven by a fundamentally different understanding of economic justice and the role of government.
Indeed. It's portrayed as a comprehensive vision for reshaping not just the economy, but the social contract itself, rooted in this idea of a significant rebalancing towards economic fairness, towards public welfare, potentially closing that persistent gap between America's promise and the reality for millions of its people.
Wow, what a deep dive indeed. We have certainly covered an incredible amount of ground today, haven't we? Pulling apart these really intricate connections between specific economic policy choices, their immediate impact on everyday life, and then the potential for those impacts to spark these profound political realignments. I mean, from the Liberation Day tariffs to the mass deportations, we saw how these policy choices can apparently create this negative supply shock, contributing to that sticky inflation, slowing growth, and really forcing the Federal Reserve into almost impossible bind.
Right. And then we explored that fascinating, frankly quite detailed outline of a political strategy, that three-pronged approach involving, sophisticated partisan gerrymandering, the potential gutting of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and that really controversial, historically unprecedented idea of a mid-decade census, all seemingly aimed at fundamentally altering congressional and even electoral college representation. Then we tied those economic pressures directly back to potential political fallout, envisioning how that pain felt by consumers could translate into a decisive shift in congressional power, and how that, in turn, could potentially open the door for a whole new political era, maybe driven by a more progressive vision focused on economic fairness and a reimagined social contract.
So after digesting all of that, what does this all mean for you as our listener? How do you even begin to process such a dense, maybe even unsettling picture of America's potential near future?
Well, ultimately, I think what the Barackface sources are suggesting is that America is truly in the midst of a high-stakes experiment right now. It's really a test of whether the country's inherent strengths, its technological dynamism, especially with AI rapidly advancing, and maybe the underlying resilience of its institutions can overcome these seemingly self-inflicted economic wounds and these really aggressive political maneuvers we've discussed. Or, conversely, does it risk a replay of past economic struggles, like the stagflation of the 1970s? And could that potentially lead to a fundamental reordering of its political and economic priorities, maybe in ways we haven't seen for half a century? The outcome, the sources really emphasize this. It's not preordained. It's not set in stone. It's being shaped right now in real time by the choices being made and, critically, by the responses to those choices from all parts of society.
That's a powerful way to frame it. So as we look at these potential scenarios, this high-stakes experiment unfolding right in front of us, maybe the final thought to leave everyone with is this. What responsibility does this new understanding, this deeper dive into these potential futures, place on us, the citizens, in actively shaping which path America actually takes in the coming crucial decades?